Hello, and welcome to Introducing Me. I'm your host, Sarah. I started this podcast to get to know other people and lifestyles while discovering more about myself. Each episode, I will give a new guest a chance to discuss their background, culture, interests, or whatever they want to talk about to help increase all of our own worldviews. Today, I would like to introduce you to Anya. They are an author and social work student in New York City, and they have bipolar disorder and a history of anorexia. Their goal is to help people learn that mental health recovery and creative dreams are both achievable. So I'm really excited to talk to Anya today. So Anya, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for creating this space for folks to share, especially in these kind of isolating times that we continue to find ourselves in. So I'm Anya. I was born in Massachusetts, grew up in North Carolina, and then moved to New York City when I started my undergrad at Columbia. I majored in English and theater, and I thought I wanted to get a PhD in English, but it turns out I really didn't. And I left graduate school with a master's, spent a couple of years trying to figure myself out. I took a really great job teaching young adults in foster care. And that really made me fall in love with the idea of doing something in social work and working in the mental health field. Mental health has obviously been a huge part of my life. I have struggled with mental illness pretty much as long as I can remember. Um, I have always had some sort of like identifiable mood disorder. It was eventually diagnosed just this past summer as bipolar 2, which is basically like periods of depression followed by periods of elevated mood. Um, and it took me a really long time to get that diagnosis and kind of understand what was going on with me. And at the same time, I was seeing other young adults really struggling with access to mental health, quality mental health care. Um, and so I wanted to do something sort of with that. The other piece of that side of things is I've been in recovery from an eating disorder since 2015, which is a long time now. And it's super, super difficult to get quality care for eating disorders, especially for people who are not significantly underweight. And so my research project for my social work master's is about kind of redefining the way that we think about anorexia and restrictive eating disorders in general. And so that's another kind of thing that I'm really passionate about. And now I'm going to talk about my book. So I've also always been really involved in creative arts. I've done theater pretty much since I could walk. Now my PhD in English was going to be looking at performances of Shakespeare. That's mostly what I like to do in theater. I direct um, productions of Shakespeare's plays with a focus on race, gender, and sexuality, and making those themes kind of legible for a modern audience. And then I'm also a creative writer. I started writing my novel, Queen of All, when I was 11 years old, which was about the same year of onset of anorexia for me, and not a great time in any like chubby, unpopular gay kid's life, middle school. So it took me probably 10 years to finish a first draft of the novel. And it was very tied to me in my like journey to mental health. And I kind of thought that like the book being done was going to be the prize at the end of the rainbow of that journey. But it wasn't. That wasn't how it worked out. I got to the end of that and I got to a place of like more health myself, but there was still a really long way to go on bringing the book to people. And so I think the last couple of years of my life have really been about figuring out how I can do the work that I need to do to be successful with this book, to bring it to readers, to help audiences connect with it, while also focusing on myself and what I need, and advocating for people who want to live a like richly creative life while also living a happy, healthy life. I think we have a really pretty damaging idea that's become very ingrained in our society that like art comes from a place of like suffering or like internal torment, or like the way to have interesting stories to tell is to be in pain, like psychic pain. And I think that's a pretty bad narrative. And I want to try to do what I can to dismantle that. And then specifically for bipolar disorder, which I don't think a lot of people really understand very well, creativity is actually considered to be one of the hallmark signs of bipolar. And a lot of people who have bipolar disorder experience these kind of moments of wild creativity during episodes of mania or hypomania. So I know that, like, for me, I always did the vast majority of my writing in these like 10, 15, 25-hour chunks with no breaks. And I didn't recognize for years that like that was hypomania. And so once I got diagnosed and got on medication, which for me has been the most effective treatment, I have had to like completely reimagine my creative practice and my creative life. Um, and I went through this like pretty typical, I think, stage of like, what if I never write again? What if that was like the last interesting thing I ever did? And I think that that really hasn't been true for me. My writing has gotten better, I think, because I write fewer words now, but they're better ones, with more focus and attention to craft. And so I think that story is really important to me. And then the other thing that's really important to me is this book, which I can talk a little bit about. So Queen of All is the first in a planned trilogy. It's a God, I'm so bad about at talking about this book. You would think that like 8 months after your book comes out, you would have figured out how to I would have figured out how to give like a concise summary of it by now, but I still can't. Look at the back cover. My editor did a great job summarizing, and I do a lousy job. So it's a young adult fantasy, kind of in the classic YA fantasy adventure vein, playing with a lot of the tropes of like rediscovering magic and coming of age and figuring out who you are. But I wanted to bring my own experiences as a queer person, and with the kind of journey towards body positivity, and we're just representing a really different kind of protagonist. When I was a kid, I like devoured books like this one. I mean, you can, I guess the people listening will not be able to see. I live in a New York City apartment by myself with one cat and 600 novels, and 300 square feet, right? So like clearly, I go through a lot of books. And my favorite was always like the YA fantasy adventure coming of age story. The interesting thing about those books is that they're always about a protagonist who feels very different than everybody else around her. It's often her, sometimes it's a boy. Feels very different, feels like no one around can understand them, like nobody can connect with them, which were themes that I really related to when I was a young adult reader. But if you look at who these protagonists are, they're always like white, thin, able bodied, straight, cisgender. So like they're just like they're the they're the oddball or the outcast, but not for any of the reasons that, like in my experience, tend to make the young people that are reading those books into oddballs or outcasts, that don't get acceptance in their community in the real world. So I wanted to kind of write a book that would be a story like those stories, but also let some of those young readers actually see themselves in those kinds of stories. And that's my book. It came out on June 8th, from Zenith Publishing, which is a small press. And both of the sequels are forthcoming. There's one coming in, book 2 is coming in October. Book 3 doesn't have a release date yet. So I am also in this really exciting place of starting to think about where else my career is going to go, because me and my life have always really been defined by this book. This is, I mean, publishing this book has been my dream since I was 11 years old. And then like 8 months ago, I did it and now it's done. Which is in some ways very scary, but in other ways has left me um, with a lot of possibility to imagine like what other things might I write? What other artistic projects might I take on? What other ways can I help like give back to my communities other than by like, you know, my plan of like curing homophobia by writing this one book? Like, what are other things I could do towards that goal? So I'm also in kind of an exciting place right now, and I'll be graduating from NYU with my master's in social work in like 3 months. So hopefully that'll be a way to make some of that change as well.
Yeah, you've got so much going on and so many good things. It's really exciting. And since the listeners can't see all of your great books, you seem to have them organized by color, which I think is very pretty.
Thank you. Surprisingly controversial. A lot of people hate it.
Yeah, I like my stance on it, as long as you can like find the thing you're looking for. To me, that would be the struggle.
Yeah, this is really nerdy. I keep them all in a database so that I don't accidentally buy the same title twice. And I include the spine colors.
See, that's the way to do it. So we have a lot of things that we could talk about or that I can ask you about. But I want to start with, you mentioned how it took a while to get the bipolar diagnosis. So can you talk a little bit about that journey and then what getting that diagnosis meant to you?
Yeah. I don't know if it was really a journey. It was just like I I went to a psychologist for the first time when I was probably 13 or 14, and they were like, "Oh, you have anxiety and depression because that's what we diagnose people with," which is like, I say that flippantly. I want to be like crystal clear that like anxiety and depression are real mental illnesses and they can be very, very serious and life defining for people who have them, but they are not the only two mental illnesses that exist. Um, and I think there can be a real lack of understanding of what other kinds of symptomology look like. Um, Nobody really brought up the idea of misdiagnosis again until when I was in eating disorder treatment. There was some talk about the addition of some other kind of non mood related diagnoses like OCD um, to my chart. But generally, like when you're in an active phase of an eating disorder, they don't really want to make too many assumptions about what's going on beneath that. Um, and then after I left treatment, I wanted to do anything except think about mental health for a little while because I had just spent 5 months with my entire life on a complete hold while I like got my brain right, which was not as you can maybe tell. I like to be busy. And it was not an easy thing for me to do to like take a break from my whole life. Um, I didn't take a break for my whole life. I convinced them to let me stay in school instead of taking a break, like I, in retrospect, should have. But and those are all very classic actions for somebody with undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Can't stop, can't take a break, can't figure out making like lots of, pretty bad and impulsive decisions. Um, I think I avoided a lot of the most serious consequences that people with this diagnosis tend to face for a couple of reasons. I had a lot of other things like kind of going for me that let me stay ahead of it. I've always done really well academically. So if I had like a depressive period and couldn't work on my schoolwork, I've always known like I do assignments as soon as they're assigned to me so that with that like burst of energy that I get, so that if I can't work on it, oh well, it's already done. Um, and so like things like that are things about me. I'll also say that like I have had a ton of privilege. I've had parents who can support me financially when I needed like intensive care for mental health. I have almost always had health insurance and access to psychiatric care. And so all of those things have meant that as much as the symptoms of bipolar disorder have been a struggle for me throughout my life, um, I haven't had the kind of suffering based on them that a lot of, like, for example, the people that I work with now in my clinical internship do. And that's not necessarily a difference in the severity of the symptom. It's a difference in the severity of the consequence that you face for your symptoms based on like where you come from in life. Like if I had a manic episode and I'm looking at it right now, bought a $400 Dutch oven, even though I was working for a social work agency, and that was what, like 300% of my spending money for the month, right? Um, that's okay. I still wouldn't like be homeless or not have food to cook and eat in my Dutch oven. Like I could be insulated from the consequences of some of the suffering that comes from those symptoms. So I had it about 2 years ago. I had a doctor suggest to me that I might have bipolar disorder, based on the fact that a previous psychiatrist had kind of insisted I start taking antidepressants. And I had a pretty classic manic episode triggered by the antidepressants, which is like a hallmark sign of bipolar disorder. For whatever reason, that doctor didn't like crack the code, but another one did and suggested it. And I stormed out of her office. I was like, "No way! That is so offensive." It was an intake with the first time I'd seen the psychiatrist, and I was like, "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. How can you like make this assumption about me? I will never see you again. Off I go." And I think that really came from stigma. Again, I think that there's been a lot of really great advocacy work done around like anxiety and depression diagnoses. And a lot more like light has been brought to the fact that like um, lots and lots of like quote unquote normal, healthy, functional people can have those diagnoses and like go about their lives. Um, Bipolar disorder is considered a severe mental illness, and I think not nearly as much work has been done to destigmatize that. I think a lot of like, for example, celebrities have spoken up about either depression or anxiety diagnoses or diagnoses within those diagnostic categories. Not as many with like other disorders, especially like severe mental illness, which is a problematic classification, but I don't have to go into that. Um, and so I did. I walked right out of her office and I never went back. And when her office sent me a bill for the appointment that I walked out of, I ignored it. Oops, sorry. um, and I called my dad, who's a physician, and I was like, "Isn't that ridiculous?" And he was like he was very careful not to say that he wanted to give me a diagnosis because he's my father, not my physician. But he seemed to think it wasn't such a terrible idea. Um, and I think that kind of got me started thinking, so that when the psychiatrist I see now was like, "So we went up and we went up and we went up on the antidepressant, and it is not working. Like, it's helping with the depression, but not with the anxiety." And anxiety was what I was calling these periods of time where like I couldn't sit still and I couldn't focus on anything. And I felt so much pressure to get things done. And I got really irritable. And I got really impulsive. And it wasn't working with that. And she was like, "Would you want to try thinking maybe something else?" So I wasn't like handed a diagnosis, I was handed a medication, the mood stabilizing medication. And I took it, and then almost immediately, I started to feel better in a way that like I never have in my entire life. The diagnosis itself, like I wouldn't say that it has like become part of my identity, or that like the word, bipolar is not necessarily meaningful to me as such. I think this is like an essay. This is not an interesting topic for a podcast, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. But like, psychiatric diagnostic criteria are really, really problematic, and they're not based on, a lot of them aren't based on rigorous science or rigorous research. They're just kind of words that we use for clinicians to be able to help have conversations with each other to treat people more effectively. And some of them are good ones and some of them are bad ones. I think bipolar is like a pretty useful diagnostic category. So I don't find it to be like personally, I guess, immensely important. What it's been really important for is that like having this diagnosis instead of a different incorrect diagnosis meant access to treatment that is like actually effective for me. And I think again, with the kind of catch-all of anxiety and depression, there's a lot of focus on like antidepressants as a treatment, SSRIs and SNRIs in particular. And the fact that those medications are guess and check, and you don't really know if they're working, and their onset is really slow. And all of those things are true, but my experience was also that like, hey, if the medication you're on isn't doing anything, maybe that's not because you have to give it, another 16 weeks to work. Maybe that's because it's not the right medication because it's not treating the right disorder. So that has definitely been the impactful part for me, was recognizing that like, oh, hey, medication can actually help. And it's been a really eye-opening experience for me as someone who, will hopefully be providing, well, I do already in a non-clinical capacity as an intern, but hopefully will eventually have my own practice and be providing direct mental health services to people. That difference that the diagnostic category can make, because for a long time I didn't see a lot of value to that label, and I didn't feel like medication could be that helpful. All the value I'd gotten out of treatment, I'd gotten in therapy. And then it turns out that actually it's the right medication that's helpful, not just anyone. And so that's been really, I think, a valuable lesson for me to take. It's also been really valuable for me to recognize that stigma does live within myself, because I think I would not have said that there was any chance when I walked out of that psychiatrist's office. I would not have said there was any chance I was acting out of internalized stigma. I would have said, like, I work in the mental health field. I've been in recovery for years. I've been seeing a therapist since I was in middle school. Like, I don't have any stigma about mental illness. Why would I? But I did, and I still do. And we all do. And so I think that has also been a really important reframing that has come for me in the wake of this diagnosis. And it's the reason a lot of people might like choose to keep their diagnostic information slightly more private. It's the reason I'm talking about it with you here tonight. I bring it up all the time at school. Like, I want people to be aware that, there isn't any mental health diagnosis that limits your ability to like function in the world, do the things you want to do, be the person you want to be. There are, different challenges and sometimes some impairments or some needed supports that go with different diagnoses, but there's no diagnosis that's like a death sentence to the life that you want to live.
And I appreciate you sharing all of that. And like you said, I think like there's been a lot of great work with depression and anxiety and normalizing going to therapy, but there is still, as you said, that stigma for certain things. And, just by sharing it for you, like it's helping break that down. So of course, mental health has been a big part of your life, and then part of the reason why you're now studying it and wanting to work in a paid capacity. So is there any, Like, are you ever worried that like your own mental health struggles could affect your ability to help others with their mental health?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, the mental health field is not necessarily like super hospitable to disability of any kind. Like, I'm at a clinical internship right now, and um, I work with some folks with the same diagnosis I do. I'll get into that in a minute. But the people that I work with are like super understanding and super encouraging. And also, like, the structure of social work school is that for the whole year, you get 3 days off from your internship. And if you miss more than that, they won't let you have your license. And so, like, if I need a fourth day off because I'm having a breakdown, like, what happens? I mean, admittedly, like, I would be okay. I could make up the hours, but like, there is a really high burden on on this kind of work. There is still, I have also found stigma less in the folks that I work with. I think for people, professionals who've been working in the field, a lot of them I found have worked through this. But for my fellow students, I do notice there's a lot of separation between like us, high achievers, probably struggle with some anxiety, definitely go to therapy, all that good stuff, and them are clients, and those are the people who have serious mental illness diagnoses. We don't. They do. And so it can be, I sometimes, like, I've been in classrooms where I feel like I have to be like, actually, this is not something that only happens to aliens from another planet. First of all, like, that's not a good way to think about your clients. And secondly, like, I am sitting right here. And I am in this room with you, and I'm getting the same degree you're getting, and GPA is probably better than yours. Like, we don't need to it doesn't need to be, we think of stigma as coming from like a place of like harsh emotion and rejection and like anger or hatred and those kinds of really negative emotions, but stigma can also come in the form of this kind of like infantilization, or this kind of like othering, I guess. And that's been a challenge that I have definitely seen. And then the other really big question, and this is an ongoing question, is self-disclosure. For a long time in therapy, in psychology, like classic Freud, you lie on a couch, you talk about your mother psychology. The idea was that the therapist was the tabula rasa, the blank slate, and showed no emotion and told you nothing about themselves. And that idea has pretty much been completely dismantled in contemporary therapeutic practice. I think a pretty bad idea. And increasingly, there's an understanding that the use of yourself and your own experiences is valuable in taking care of other people, and specifically that lived experience is can be a really valuable thing in supporting somebody that you work with in a therapeutic relationship. I mean, this is like very fundamental to why I want to go into this field. The place where I was treated for my eating disorder hires almost exclusively recovered clinicians, so people who have a personal experience with an eating disorder of their own that they're willing to share with clients. And I couldn't have done it without that. Like, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. It was so hard. If someone who I didn't know had been through it themselves had been like, here's a sandwich, you have to eat it, I would have thrown it in their face. Like, I couldn't have done it, right? Knowing that the person who was asking me to do that thing for myself was someone who'd been through it themselves was like, that was the only reason a lot of days that I was able to make it through. And I also, like, I continue to work with a clinician for my own therapy with lived experiences in mental health that are somewhat similar to mine. And again, like I find that really helpful. I am starting to recognize now, and this is why they make you go to school before you're allowed to go into practice, starting to recognize now that I don't want to paint with a broad brush. So, like, the information about my own mental health history will always be available to clients if they want to go looking for it, right? I go on podcasts and I talk about it. I write articles about it. I publish journal chapters about it. Like, it's not a secret for anyone who wants to look for it. It's not always the right decision to share it, to bring it in, because sometimes that doesn't make enough space for the other person who's supposed to be the person that it's all about in that moment. And so that's something that I'm hopefully gonna continue to learn how to get better at finding those moments where it isn't the right thing to bring in. And I guess the final thing is like thinking about can working in a mental health field potentially be like triggering or set my own like recovery back. Sometimes I worry about this with getting into the eating disorders field, as I might eventually like to do. Haven't tried that yet, so I guess I'm just gonna have to wait and see how it goes. I think that's pretty far. That feels pretty far behind me a lot of the time. But I don't know what it'll actually be like to be in the room with people that are, struggling really actively. At the internship I'm at now, when I work with like people who also have a bipolar diagnosis, no, I mean the only thing it really like triggers in me is a lot of sort of like righteous outrage because I really see that like how different the paths through like navigating life are. Same diagnosis, a lot of the same symptoms, but based on like systemic factors, poverty, racism, child abuse, the differences in outcomes. And I'm painting in a very broad brush here, obviously, because like I want to, respect everybody's privacy completely. But I do really like as a broad trend, I do really see, I think a lot like, there, but for the grace of God goes I, but like the grace of God in this case is like privilege. And so I think it's made me really mindful of that. And maybe has given me a little bit of some advantage in being able to help sort out like what are the symptoms caused by the diagnosis and what are the structural factors at play. And so that's not necessarily something I worry about. It's maybe something I like carry, but it doesn't, I don't, I think ultimately it's helpful, even if it's sometimes hard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, you mentioned earlier how, like, obviously your own mental health is so important. So it's not like you're leaving your own mental health, like, story, recovery, continued maintenance per se to, like, go help other people. Like, that's still going to be there. So if something does happen, like, you're not ignoring your own self.
Yeah.
Now, then you also brought, your life and your experiences into a fictional book to make sure that representation existed for your main character. So, what has it been like writing a book since the age of 11? Like, was it always going to be a trilogy? Did you always see the first book, like, coming to fruition as it did?
No, so initially I conceived it as one kind of long book. I was 11, so I didn't know like how long it was going to end up being once I started writing it down. I didn't have a great sense of that. A lot of things I didn't have a great sense of. Um I started writing it thinking extending it to be a single long volume. That changed pretty quickly. But like I did not know that the main character was gay when I started writing it. 'Cause I didn't know I was gay. I didn't really totally know what gay was. I sort of understood. I had a crush on another girl at that point, and I told my mom, another girl in my Sunday school class. I told my mom about it. Sorry, mom, this is gonna make you look bad. My mom's great, and my mom was like, "That's okay. Everybody, all that happens to all little girls. All girls get crushes on their friends, and it passes." Um, and the subtext there, again, sorry, mom, was like, "You can still grow up to be normal and straight. Don't worry about it." And like, I was like 11, so I was like, okay, and I just took that at face value and assumed it was true. It wasn't. Um, and I, so I didn't know I was gay. I definitely didn't know that Jenna, the main character of the book, was gay. But I did know that she was in love with her best friend, that when that friend like grew up and got married to a man, she was like intensely jealous of that relationship. And I think a lot of those things those themes are really like universally relatable to kids that age. Jenna's about 14 in the first book, that like, kids that age, like they mature at different rates, and different kids are going to be ready for like having a first boyfriend or girlfriend, or going on dates, or starting to think about like, those parts of life sooner than their friends are. I was a little bit of a late bloomer in that area, especially because like, I didn't know that I was gay. But it's pretty, I think it's pretty normal, like regardless of orientation, for kids to have some trouble figuring that out with their friends, as friendships, start to change when young people start to change, and they start to, certainly a 14-year-old is still very much a child, but start to move towards thinking about becoming an adult someday. Your friendships change, and they don't stay the same as they were. And so I think that theme has always been present. It ended up in the finished book looking like a story about also coming out and unrequited romantic feelings, and sort of a unrequited romantic feelings makes it sound more dramatic and much more grown up than it is. It's a first crush. And I think like showing that experience for like LGBTQ readers is also really, really important to me. So that's a big thing that changed. The other thing that changed is really close to publication is the way that I thought about the like representation of body types in the book. So uh, Cece, who is the sort of love interest, she's the best friend that Jenna is in love with, is supposed to be the most beautiful girl in the world, and everybody says that about her. And I decided very early on that she was going to be depicted as plus sized, and she was going to be depicted as black, because I was like, it's my fantasy book, and I can decide that the beauty standard is whatever I want it to be. Beauty standards are dumb anyway, and I'm making this one up. So like, there we go. And I thought that might be, something that would be valuable for people with those identities to get to read about, would be to like be able to see their beauty being recognized by others in the way that it doesn't always, in that kind of like classic, like the most beautiful princess in the land fashion. And I had written the book that way, and I was pretty happy with it. But there were all of these scenes where Jenna, the main character, was thinking about her, like comparing herself really negatively to Cece, especially in terms of appearance, and particularly like really unhappy with her own body. But at that point, I was describing her as being like really thin, and that she was like jealous of someone who is more voluptuous. And that just like rang so false to me throughout the entire book, because that was like the exact opposite of what I had always experienced. which was that like I was a fat child, then I was a fat teenager, and now I'm a fat adult. And at all three of those stages, people were just awful about it, and I felt just terrible. And it felt really false to me to kind of depict this character as um like dealing with the exact opposite of that, especially I mean, it's on the one hand, like it's a fantasy world. I can make the biases whatever I want them to be. On the other hand, like specifically, I was so tired of reading fantasy books where like the protagonist is like, none of the boys want to date me because I'm too skinny, because that's not something that happens in real life. So I about a year before it got picked up for publication, I rewrote the whole book to make Jenna also be plus sized. And specifically to change the focus of all of her struggles about her body from just comparing herself to her crush who's older and prettier and more self-assured, to being specifically about she looks a certain way that other people don't like. Um, and she gets treated badly because of it a lot of the time. And so that was a really big change that came like very late in the game. And it's interesting. I don't even think of it really as like a change. I think of it as like in earlier drafts, I had been like lying to myself about what this book was supposed to be about. And then like I went back and fixed it. Trying to think of like less kind of in less kind of big picture changes. I ended up bringing a lot more like Jewish mythology and some Hebrew language into the book. There's been a really like big trend towards looking at different like cultural backgrounds in YA fantasy, and also another thing I got sick of. I'm making myself sound so reactionary. Like I only write because of things other people do that I don't like. But so much fantasy is sort of like vaguely Christian, but like not Christian on purpose, just like sort of like Tolkien via C.S. Lewis via Jesus Christ to like Harry Potter Christianity. And so I thought it would be cool to like build from something else that got added in kind of later. And then a lot of things that like, make the book functional as a book rather than as a like collection of ideas that I wanted to express, like the plot, the style. All of those things came later. But a lot of the scenes and the overall like big picture plot has pretty much stayed the same.
That's really cool to hear how it's changed and how, you've brought more of like probably what it always meant to be to the surface. And it sounds like you do a good job of representing so many different things.
I try. I can't promise I get everything right. Especially because, I'm writing largely about, things I have experienced myself, but not exclusively. And I don't want to I don't want to limit the types of people that get to exist in this world to just the type of person I am. So I definitely don't get everything right, but I do my best.
Right. And it's coming from a place of authenticity, which I think is important. Now, you shared like the story of not knowing that you were gay. So what was it then like coming to that realization?
I luckily, I was a theater kid. Well, maybe not luckily, but like I was a theater kid. And so that meant that I was surrounded by the other theater kids. And they were also disproportionately most of my friends were part of the LGBTQ community when I was a young teenager. Um, and one of those friends, who was another girl, asked me out on a date. And I think we were like 13, like we were, children. And I was like, I thought that I was upset about it, but I couldn't figure out why. And I took some time to think about it. And then I was like, oh, I've cracked the code. It's because I really want to, and I feel like I shouldn't. So that was kind of how I realized, like the specific, that's how I realized that I was queer in some sense. Other things came like a lot later. I dated men until about 2 years ago. And I still I wouldn't say that I'm like 100% lesbian, completely not interested in men. And I have like been romantically involved with non-binary and trans people too. Uh, I mostly, it's very important to me that like I be involved with the LGBTQ community, and that's the most important like aspect of my identity to me. Mostly I've dated women. That's probably mostly what I'll do, but like who knows? In terms of gender identity, I sort of broadly identify as non-binary. I generally use they them pronouns for like my public appearances, such as they are. It's on what's on my book jacket, etc. I don't feel the reason that's so recent is because I only recently learned that some people feel an attachment to gender one way or the other. I really don't. I could care less. To me, it feels very kind of like loose and like, the only reason, like, I'm only a woman insofar as like this is the identity that I got dropped into. I don't feel attached to it, but I certainly don't mind it. And I like to joke that like I'm only a woman in the sense that like woman is like a cool club full of cool people that I like, and like I don't mind being part of like the club of women. I just if gender identity is based on how you feel in your heart and soul, I don't feel it. If it's based on which club you'd like to be a part of, then like sure, I can like round up to being a woman. And so I think that those as you can see, I'm kind of like dancing around like identity labels, right? Like, I don't really want to say that I'm a lesbian. It definitely doesn't feel right to say that I'm bi anymore, although I used that as a term for like 10 years. Sometimes I'll just say I'm gay or I'm queer as kind of a shorthand for like identifying with the community. I think I care very little these days about the words, and very much about the experience, which was not so much an experience of figuring out a word that worked as it was an experience of figuring out, like, oh, this is part of why I feel so different than everybody else. I already feel like I look different from everybody else and I act different from everybody else, because of my uh, ethno-religious background and my body size and my undiagnosed mental illness. And now I've figured out like another piece of the puzzle of why I feel so persistently so different than everybody else. And when like the other kids around me are thinking about their future lives, I'm like, I don't want a husband. Like talking about like, what's your wedding going to be like? I hope I never have to have one. Like that's how I felt when I was, 14, right? When, gay marriage was not I never thought that it would happen so quickly. And I grew up in North Carolina where like it was not a glint in anyone's eye yet. And so that was really like, it was, I think, an experience of recognizing, and I think this comes through in the book. I stole this experience for the book that like I knew that there was something that was different about me. I knew there were a lot of things that were different about me that sometimes made other people not be very nice to me. And I didn't know what they all were. I knew some of them. But when you don't know what they are, all you're kind of left with is wondering if something is sort of wrong with you that makes other people not like you. And so I went with that for a really long time. And eventually I started to realize that like, there are other people that are different in the same way that I'm different. And maybe I can go hang out with them instead and they'll be nice to me. Which like, obviously it's not perfect like that. But it is, I think it was a very important process of recognition for me. And again, so like if there's a way that I can kind of speed that up for other people, I think that's really important to me. And I also I think and I hope, and it seems like from what I know, that it is not nearly as hard now as it was when I was 14.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as hard to figure out because you're 14 now, you probably do know that gay people exist. Um, you It's probably not a big, huge shock. I mean, it wasn't like I knew a couple of gay people, but they were all like my couples, my parents' age and older. There weren't any gay people on TV or in the books that I read. Mostly I read books. There weren't any gay people in them ever. I was, I think, 15 or 16 the first time I read a book with an LGBTQ character. It was Linda Lowe's Ash. And I remember it. So because I read thousands of books and I'd never seen one with somebody like, with the same experience as I had. So I'm hoping that, when I wrote the book, I wrote it thinking that it was going to be like, it was going to change everything. And then everything kind of changed around the book while I was writing it and trying to get it published. Things managed to change without my, brilliant work of staggering genius. I don't know how they did it, but I'm definitely glad that things found a way to change on their own.
Yes, and of course your book is a part of that change as we continue to see more and more diversity in the books that we read. So now at the end of every episode, I do ask a random question, not having to do anything we've talked about. So my question for you is, if you had a secret society, what would the mission be?
I mean, it would be to get books to people who need them. It would be to get books into the hands of people who haven't had access to them. I've worked with um, kids who are graduating high school with really limited literacy because they haven't gotten a proper education. Worked with kids who have never owned a book in their entire life because they haven't been able to afford one. There's all the talk of like book banning in schools, and not just young people, but like people of all ages who can't read the books that they want to read because they're not out there or they don't have access to them. One thing that I think we don't think about when we talk about access to books is that like you can only have access to the books that show up in your like in your bookstore or in your library, but the vast majority of what is written is never published. And the vast majority of what is published never goes into any particular bookstore or library or other book dispensing outlet. So yeah, if I could do a secret, it would be like a secret society where we sort of like, I'm taking this idea from Q and Willow, which is a really wonderful bookstore in Queens, New York, and they have a like little secret basket under the registry. And if you go there and you are an LGBTQ teenager and you say, "Hey, I need a book," from the book basket, you can just pick one and you can just leave with it. You can just have it. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to tell your parents or ask them for $20 to buy the book. And that would be my that would be the mission of my secret society, is we would go around the world connecting books to the people that need them.
All right, that brings this episode to a close. I will, of course, be leaving links for Anya in the description. So their website, which has all sorts of information that you can get in contact with them, and also a direct link to be able to buy the book. That is Queen of All, first of the trilogy, out now. And so that direct link will be there, but is also accessible through their website. And of course, our website for the podcast is in the description as usual. So that brings us to all of our social media, Instagram, Facebook and LinkedIn, along with all the past text from every episode, and more contact information and resources from all of my prior guests. And of course, if you would like to donate to the podcast, a link to do that is in the description as well, along with my email. If you would like to be a guest, you can of course reach out. So thank you so much, Anya, for spending time with me today, and to my listeners for taking the time out of your day to hear a new story. Until next time, bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.